He didn't bow, he didn't salute, he didn't even move aside when Donald Trump saw Princess Charlotte walking toward him inside Buckingham Palace. He turned his back. But the royal guard behind her wasn't just standing there for decoration. His name was Sergeant Alden Mercer, Coldstream veteran, protocol expert. And when he saw the flicker of embarrassment on the young princess's face, he broke formation. What happened next didn't make headlines. But inside the palace, everyone remembers the sentence he said and the salute that followed. Now, before we tell you exactly what happened in that corridor, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from and hit subscribe if you haven't already. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The marble beneath his boots gleamed like still water, each tile pristine, waxed and time-worn all at once. Sergeant Alden Mercer stood motionless at the midpoint of Buckingham Palace's grand state corridor, a man carved from posture and protocol. 43 years old, Coldstream Guard, former Afghan tour. Rumour had it that in 2 decades of service he'd never once blinked during formation. To the palace staff, he was simply called the Corridor Sentinel. Soft footsteps echoed far behind him, polished soles gliding in rhythm, lighter and smaller than most. A child's steps, but trained. Princess Charlotte, 11 years old, refined beyond her years, moved like the hallway was a cathedral. She walked a deliberate pace with her back straight, arms close to her sides, cradling a slim folder in her gloved hands. The crisp navy of her dress coat brushed her knees as she advanced beside her guard, neither rushing nor dawdling. Every once in a while, she'd glance up to nod politely at passing footmen who bowed low in return, their eyes respectful but always brief. Charlotte's governess wasn't present. Not today. The king had specifically asked for this short journey, from the royal study to the East Gallery, to be done with only one escort, the guard he trusted most with his daughter's safety. That trust wore black boots and red wool. The corridor itself was silent but alive. Portraits of monarchs stared down, oil paint eyes watching from another century. Heavy doors flanked either side at intervals, most closed, some just cracked open as aides and attendants moved respectfully behind them. Gold sconces dotted the walls. An older steward passed by and nodded to Mercer, who didn't move. He never did while on post. His duty was not to speak, only to act when necessary. Charlotte glanced toward a distant arch ahead. The eastern wing was just beyond. Her schedule today included a private cultural briefing, something about visiting artifacts from the royal collection. It didn't matter. What mattered was pace, posture, and protocol, the way her mother had taught her, the way her grandmother had insisted on. She didn't speak. Mercer didn't either. The two moved like parts of the same formation, her presence barely 5 paces ahead of his steady escort, close enough to protect, far enough to respect tradition. A palace footman paused near the side wall, lowering his tray and bowing slightly as the princess passed. Charlotte returned the gesture with a subtle tilt of her chin. The Grand State corridor was long, almost too long, designed for dramatic arrivals, but on quiet days like this, it could feel like a tunnel of memory. Mercer's eyes flicked once, right to left, watching movement up ahead. A faint noise. Laughter. Sharp, animated voices. Not staff. He narrowed his gaze. A figure stood in the distance now, barely visible beyond the archway. Donald Trump. Standing bold, speaking louder than the hallway was built for, hands gesturing, several aides around him, one of them waving towards something on a tablet. Mercer didn't stop walking, but he did slow, by a single fraction of a pace. The closer they came, the clearer the noise became. Not the polished, clipped tones of palace aides, but something rougher, more declarative, a voice that filled too much space, even in a room built for kings. Donald Trump, flanked by 2 suited aides and a younger staffer clutching a leather folio, stood squarely in the middle of the Grand State Corridor's eastern third, talking loudly, gesturing with full arms, completely unaware or unmoved by the ceremonial atmosphere around him. He wasn't supposed to be there, or rather, he was, but not now. His scheduled walkthrough of the East Gallery was timed for after Princess Charlotte's passage, but he had decided to take a shortcut, a quick look, at the portraits beyond the corridor. No one had stopped him. Now he was here, blocking the corridor's natural flow, unaware of what was approaching. Charlotte didn't change her expression. She saw him, of course, heard him. Her steps remained even, unshaken, though Mercer noted the way she adjusted her folder, holding it closer, like a shield. One of Trump's aides noticed them first. He murmured something. Trump kept talking. The aide tried again, softly gesturing down the hall. Trump turned, half-glanced in their direction, just long enough to register who it was. Princess Charlotte, alone, but for one guard. For a moment, his brow lifted, just slightly. Then, without a word, he turned away, shoulders pivoting deliberately, and returned to his loud conversation as though she were no more than another staff member passing through. It was small. It was subtle, but inside Buckingham Palace, inside these walls, it was a break. Protocol dictated that senior royals, no matter their age, were to be acknowledged in formal passage by all visiting heads of state and diplomats. A slight bow, a nod, or, in rare ceremonial instances, a salute. Nothing theatrical. Just the recognition that this ground and the bloodline it belonged to were to be honoured. Mercer did not break stride, but his posture shifted, just slightly more forward, the way a soldier anticipates tension. Charlotte kept walking too. She adjusted her direction slightly to avoid brushing too close, still giving Trump room. She said nothing, didn't flinch. But her eyes, just for a second, fell downward. It was the look, not of defeat, but of discomfort. Mercer caught it. She never looked down. The staff nearby noticed it too. A steward turned toward the wall, as if to busy himself. A young archivist in the distance stopped moving mid-step. Trump continued speaking, louder now, as if to underline the point. Mercer said nothing, but something in his walk changed. A quiet coil tightening beneath the surface of his stillness. They were now just a few steps away, close enough that the princess could no longer pass without deliberate navigation. The corridor's natural width had been narrowed by Trump's stance and his cluster of staff. The aides had the good sense to edge away, creating a semblance of space, but Trump remained fixed, feet apart, mid-sentence, arms gesturing toward a portrait of Queen Victoria behind him as he recounted a story no one had asked to hear. Princess Charlotte slowed, not enough to make it obvious, but enough that the pause could be felt. She shifted to the left, then adjusted back again as Trump's footwork unintentionally blocked her new angle. She was taught never to weave, never to beg passage. Mercer observed it all, his pace unchanged, but his eyes locked forward now, tracking every movement. The princess was now within 6 feet of the former president, and still no gesture of acknowledgement had been offered. Then it happened. As she passed the invisible midpoint of his presence, Charlotte gave the smallest motion of royal courtesy, a soft nod, barely perceptible, born of habit and training, a silent offering of grace. Trump ignored it. He didn't just miss it. He actively turned further away, pivoting slightly toward his younger aide, blocking her from his direct line of sight. His voice didn't lower. His gestures didn't pause. In fact, he lifted one hand dramatically, pointing toward the ceiling as he made a booming comment about how things should really look in the White House. And that was when the princess stopped. It was only for half a second, but in royal terms, a half-second hesitation is a shout. Charlotte's heel hovered briefly above the marble. Then she planted it again, steady, posture upright. But her chin dipped, eyes cast just low enough that anyone watching could see it was not ceremonial deference. It was to avoid meeting eyes. It was embarrassment. Mercer's pace adjusted by a single heartbeat, but not to hesitate. It was the pause of calculation, of judgment. His boots were louder now, closer. The heel-to-toe rhythm precise, measured. He looked straight ahead. Trump remained turned away. Charlotte made one last quiet attempt to continue, but the path ahead was still not fully open. She'd have to brush too close to him, something that risked either offence or discomfort. And she wouldn't do that, not even now. For a flicker of time, the princess, the granddaughter of the king, stood in her own corridor, boxed in by noise and ignorance, her dignity suspended in mid-air. Behind her, the boots stopped. Sergeant Alden Mercer no longer walked. He stood. Just long enough for the room to register the weight of it. Then he took one step forward. The sound of Sergeant Alden Mercer's boot striking the marble was not loud, but it was precise, a singular echo in a space that had gone utterly still. In the grand state corridor, where paintings of sovereigns watched from every gilded frame, where every footstep was meant to pass unnoticed, Mercer's step carried judgment. Donald Trump didn't turn immediately. He was mid-sentence, recalling a meeting in Berlin, gesturing with his left hand, oblivious to the silence now growing around him. But his aides noticed. The younger staffer holding the folio tensed, sensing something shift. One of the older aides instinctively began to say, "Sir," but stopped himself. He didn't know what was happening yet, but he knew the temperature in the corridor had changed. Mercer took another step, slow, exact, deliberate. His black boots echoed cleanly against the floor as he moved forward with ceremonial weight. One pace, then another, then one more, and then he stopped. Right between Donald Trump and Princess Charlotte, not in aggression, but in assertion, not blocking, but defining the boundary. He did not raise a hand, he did not raise his voice. But when he spoke, the words were ironclad. "You will salute Her Royal Highness." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't anger. It was protocol, distilled into one sentence. Trump blinked, as if he hadn't quite heard it. His voice caught in his throat. For the first time since arriving in the palace, he was not the one filling the space. Charlotte stood behind Mercer, posture still regal, though her hands were now gripped a little tighter around the folder she carried. She said nothing. A distant steward, halfway down the hall, paused mid-step. Another footman turned slightly, as if to better hear without appearing to listen. Mercer didn't move, didn't blink. His frame blocked the corridor like a drawbridge drawn tight. Every line of his uniform, the polished buttons, the perfectly creased trousers, the smooth white gloves, spoke louder than words. And it wasn't just his presence. It was what he represented. Trump's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked around. His aides didn't move. There were no cameras, no press, no one to perform for, only silence. And a guard who had chosen, for the first time in years, to speak. Mercer's eyes didn't flinch. His voice had already spoken once, and that was all the palace would allow. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about the man. It was about the girl behind him, who had done nothing but walk her corridor with grace, only to be denied the basic acknowledgement tradition demanded. Trump's expression changed. The confidence remained, but now it was measured. He straightened slightly, looked at the man in front of him, and saw no anger, only duty, and something colder than rebuke. Expectation. For a moment, no one moved. Not the aides, not the footmen, not even the chandeliers overhead, whose crystal droplets hung motionless in the air as if afraid to chime. Donald Trump stared at Sergeant Alden Mercer, eyes searching for some signal. A softening, a retreat. A flicker of doubt, but there was nothing. Only the unmoving stare of a man who had stood longer in deserts, rain, snow, and ceremony than most civilians could imagine. The silence became something tangible. It thickened the corridor like a fog. Behind Mercer, Princess Charlotte stood as she had been taught, eyes forward, chin high, back straight. But her stillness now felt different, not the practiced stillness of royal training, but the earned stillness of trust. Trump shifted. He cleared his throat, half turning toward one of his aides, as if to invite explanation, but none came. The staff had recognized what he had not. This wasn't a conversation. It was an obligation. One of the aides murmured something, quiet, barely audible. "It's a formality, sir. Just acknowledge." Trump frowned, then looked back at Mercer, and finally seemed to understand what was happening. This wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't even personal. It was about the hallway itself, the one he stood in, and what it represented. This was not a hallway in a hotel. It wasn't a red carpet to step over. It was part of a living institution, one where silence and stillness carry more weight than speeches. And in this institution, when a royal guard breaks that silence, you listen. Mercer didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His body did all the talking. His stance said, "You are not above this." His uniform said, "You are on sacred ground." His silence said, "You were given a chance to do the right thing. Now you will be made to." Trump adjusted his suit jacket, slowly, straightened his spine, and then, as if performing an unfamiliar ritual from memory, he raised his hand, a salute. It was stiff, mechanical, a little too high, but it was a salute, a formal gesture of respect. Not to the guard, not to the palace, to Princess Charlotte. Mercer held his eyes for another full beat. Then he gave the smallest nod, an acknowledgement of receipt, nothing more. Charlotte gave a small nod in return, not out of triumph, not out of pride, just quiet appreciation. And then she moved forward. She passed Trump without a glance. Her footfalls were light again, unbroken, deliberate, as they had been before. Trump lowered his hands slowly, clearing his throat again. He looked once more toward Mercer, who was already returning to his previous position. The moment was over, but the memory of it clung to the corridor walls like dust disturbed in sunlight. Behind the scenes, the whispers would begin. Quiet ones, respectful ones, the kind that never leave the palace walls but change the temperature in every room they touch. A child had been ignored, a guard had spoken, and tradition had won, not with fury, but with formality. The corridor continued behind her, but Princess Charlotte didn't look back. She walked now with renewed stillness, not the brittle kind born of fear or discomfort, but the kind that returns when the world rights itself. Her shoes glided over the polished marble with feathered precision, the kind that left no sound but still declared presence. Her dignity had been restored, not loudly, not with fanfare, but with a single sentence from a man who understood exactly what silence should protect. Sergeant Alden Mercer, now returned to his proper place behind her, walked in precise cadence, not one pace faster, not 1 inch closer. The space between them was ceremonial again. The air had cleared, yet something deeper now connected the two, an unspoken bond of protection and poise. They passed a steward, who bowed slightly lower than usual. A young palace maid standing near an open doorway folded her hands, eyes lowered, unsure whether to curtsy, but sensing something important had just happened. Charlotte didn't break rhythm. But as they neared the last gilded arch before the turn toward the East Gallery, she glanced over her shoulder, just once, and then, in a moment almost invisible to anyone not watching closely, she tilted her head ever so slightly toward Mercer. A discreet signal, just off-shoulder, one only he could see, one that wasn't required, one that meant everything. "Thank you, Sergeant," her voice didn't carry. She didn't turn fully, but the words, simple, personal, real, landed cleanly, and Mercer received them like an honour no medal could represent. He didn't smile, didn't break posture, didn't nod in return, but he answered, low and steady, "It is my duty, ma'am." There was no need for more, no ceremony for that exchange, because in the guard's world, duty speaks louder than praise, and service, true service, never asks to be seen. The princess reached the far arch and disappeared around the corner, her path now clear. The soft swirl of her navy coat was the last thing visible before she vanished into the east wing. Mercer stood still for just one breath longer. Then he turned, and resumed his silent guard position, boots squared, posture perfect, eyes forward, protocol restored. And behind him, not far, but not close, the sound of Trump's footsteps slowly fading down the corridor reminded the palace of what had just taken place. Not a confrontation, not a scandal, a correction. In Buckingham Palace, the walls do not speak, but the staff do, softly, discreetly, and only when they're certain no protocol is being breached. Later that afternoon, in the subdued hum of the East Service Wing, a senior footman named Pierce set down a tray of crystal flutes and muttered to a colleague. He told him to salute, just like that, no fuss, no shout, just told him. The other man, a newer attendant who had only been in royal service for a year, blinked. And he did? Pierce nodded once. Didn't have a choice. Mercer was on post. The story didn't spread far. It didn't need to. In the palace, moments like that didn't need amplifying. They settled into the walls on their own, like dust in shafts of sun, like the scent of polish on oak banisters. That evening, as schedules rotated and corridors cleared, the incident was barely mentioned again. There was no briefing, no debrief. The princess had continued her appointments without delay. The foreign guest had been escorted toward the northern exit wing with no further complications. But there was a new sharpness in posture among the junior guards that night. Wordless, like something had passed between the granite of the floor and the cloth of their uniforms. In the guardroom, Mercer sat for exactly 4 minutes, long enough to record his rotation in the duty ledger, long enough to wipe a faint scuff from the toe of his right boot. Then he returned the cloth to its folded square and set it back in his locker, aligned edge to edge. A junior guard, no older than 20, stepped in, saluted, and asked if Mercer had seen anything unusual during the post. Mercer looked up, stone-faced. "Nothing out of order," he said. And that was the end of that. Elsewhere, a steward recounted how the princess's chin had stayed high, how she hadn't broken stride once Mercer had stepped forward. A maid later told her sister that she saw the king's daughter pass looking taller somehow, though she hadn't grown a centimetre in weeks. There were no news headlines, no public photographs, not even a mention in internal logs. But that night, when King Charles was handed the princess's briefing schedule for the next day, a handwritten note had been added at the bottom by her private secretary. Charlotte requests Sergeant Mercer to escort her again, if possible. The king read it, said nothing. Then, with a quiet breath, he underlined the sentence with a fountain pen. Across the palace, life resumed. The chandeliers sparkled again. The hallways hummed with measured activity. Guests came and went, but there was an unspoken ripple, a shift in gravity that lingered in the grand state corridor, the place where a royal guard had spoken, once and only once, and in doing so reminded a foreign dignitary that inside these walls ceremony isn't pageantry, it's memory, it's history, it's identity, and it is not optional. The late afternoon light settled softly over Buckingham Palace, filtering through tall windows and gilded cornices like golden silk. The grand state corridor, once again cleared of visitors and activity, had returned to its quiet majesty. Marble floors reflected empty space. The air carried the faint scent of wax and time. Sergeant Alden Mercer stood alone now, reassigned temporarily to the southern interior arch, where the princess had first appeared earlier that morning. His boots were polished anew, his gloves crisp, his posture as unyielding as ever. To a passer-by, he looked no different than any other guard in any other moment of palace history. But for those who had been there, for those who had seen him step forward, the stillness now carried weight. From the far end of the corridor, 2 faint figures approached. Princess Charlotte and her governess, returning from the East Gallery. They walked at a relaxed pace, the briefing complete. The folder she once carried now tucked away. As they neared the arch, Charlotte glanced toward the guard. Her governess began to say something, a comment about supper perhaps, but the princess's eyes didn't move. She looked at Mercer, and in that fleeting instant, she offered him a nod. Smaller than before, but more personal. Not a royal gesture, not a trained courtesy, a thank you from a girl who understood what he'd done. Mercer didn't respond right away. His face remained impassive, his eyes fixed forward. But just as she passed, just when she was almost beyond his line of sight, he gave a single motion, a slight inclination of his head. No one else would have noticed it. No cameras, no audience, only her. The princess disappeared around the far turn, her steps light against the polished floor. The corridor, as always, swallowed the moment whole, restoring its silence like a curtain falling at the end of a performance. Mercer remained still. Another hour passed. A footman came and went. A steward offered a subtle salute from across the hall. The guard did not blink, did not move. Protocol had been disturbed and restored. And now, with dusk creeping in from the palace gardens and the marble reflecting nothing but memory, the institution stood taller than ever. Because someone had remembered what to protect and had done it, without needing to be asked. What would you have done in Sergeant Mercer's place? Would you have spoken up? And do you think Donald Trump truly understood what that salute meant? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. If this moment moved you, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss a story like this. And if you know someone who needs to be reminded of the power of silence and dignity, share this video with them now. Our other stories should be appearing on your screen right now. Watch those next, and I'll see you tomorrow, same time, with a brand new video.